Amen. If you have your Bible, open up to Deuteronomy chapter 34. Deuteronomy 34. As you turn there, I would like to say what a blessing it was to have Brother Alan Moran with us this morning from the Gideons, and what a powerful testimony that was shared through video. And Brother Alan has such a powerful testimony himself. Just a sweet man of God. And I tell you what, I'm just thankful for what the Gideons do for us, and just continue to pray for them as they go out and they spread the word of God in that ministry, and so thankful for it. And as you're turning to Deuteronomy 34, I must confess, as I was preparing this sermon, it's a thought that I've had for quite a while, and I was putting it down to paper, and I thought of Rupert, and I remember when I came, and apparently there was a study that had been going on for quite a while on the life of Moses. And I was preaching one day about Moses, and Rupert said, "Man, I just keep preaching on Moses." And I just thought that was so funny. So every time I preach a sermon and it has Moses in it, I always think of Brother Rupert, because he was just always such a blessing. And towards the end of his life, when I would go and sit with him and fellowship with him, and I brought that to his attention one day, and he laughed, and he said, "Yeah, I'm glad that you preached not just on Moses, just that one time when I was feeling good enough to come to church." I just love Brother Rupert. But as you turn there to Deuteronomy 34, say amen. And here in Deuteronomy 34, we find the account of Moses' death. And I don't know if you know this about me or not, but as I go through the Bible and I read, not that I'm a morbid person, but I always find it very interesting what you see at the end of these great men of God of their lives. I think that's why 1st and 2nd Timothy mean so much to me. And I've said, I preached out of 1st Timothy this morning. I preached out of 2nd Timothy last week. That last letter, especially 2nd Timothy, the last letter Paul wrote to his son in the faith. I mean, that's just dear to me. Those are the last moments in a man's life. And then when you look at King David as he gets up in years, and it's apparent that Solomon's going to become his heir apparent, and how David spends the last part of his life, it's quite amazing and quite remarkable that he spent literally the last time in his life gathering everything for the temple for Solomon to have. That's what David's, as his entirety of the last part of his life, that's what he was. He was a custodian of stuff that he would never use. And so I always find it interesting when you come up to the end of a man's life, you often see at the end of a man's life, and you can learn a whole lot from someone, especially a saint of God, right before they go home to be with the Lord. There was a man named Sam Fugate, and my father was his assistant pastor at Bible Baptist Church in Hazard, Kentucky. And Sam Fugate was a wonderful man of God, and his son, Jeff Fugate, is a wonderful man of God, pastors the biggest independent Baptist church in the state of Kentucky now out there in Lexington at Clays Mill Road Baptist Church. But when Sam was dying of cancer, and I was just a boy, I was probably Jake's size, I could just barely have any memories. But I remember one of my earliest memories was Sam Fugate sitting there riddled with cancer, and he looked terrible. I mean, he was obviously dying. It was the last time my father would ever see his mentor, the man he loved. And Sam said, "Come sit on my lap." And I went and sat on his lap, and he put his arm around me and his frail hand on my leg. And he said, "Always pray for my family. Would you do that?" And so then from then on, as a young boy, when I would come to the end of my prayer, I would say, I pray to God. I pray for Mom and Dad and Sam's family. I prayed for Sam's family every day when I was a boy, every night when we'd have family devotions. And so now, as Brother Jeff Fugate has such a large ministry, I take full credit for that. But at the end of a man's life, you learn a lot. And the end of Moses' life is no different. Look with me in Deuteronomy chapter 34. "And Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountains of Nebo to the top of Pisgah of the other against Jericho to the Lord, and showed him the land of Gilead and Dan and of Naphtali and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh and all the land of Judah unto the uttermost sea. In the south and the plain of the valley of Jericho and the city of palm trees to Zoar. And the Lord said unto him, This is the land which I swear unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, over against Beth-peor. But no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. And Moses was 120 years old when he died, and his eyes were not dim, nor was his natural force abated. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom of Moses, and laid his hands upon him. And the children of Israel hearkened unto him, and did as the Lord commanded Moses. And there arose not a prophet since Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And all the signs of the wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants, to all his land, and on all the mighty hand, and all the great terror which Moses showed into the sight of all of Israel. So here in Deuteronomy chapter 34, we're going to look at the funeral of a faithful saint this evening. The funeral of a faithful saint. Now everybody, when they talk about Moses and his death, they talk about how Moses was not allowed to go into the promised land because he sinned against God. And that's a fact. That's the truth. God told Moses to speak to the rock, and Moses in anger struck the rock. Water came forth because God is merciful and gracious in our time when we lose our temper. But God told Moses, because of that, you cannot go into the promised land. Now, we would look at that as people and say, well, that's pretty unfair. Look at everything that Moses did for God and all the things Moses sacrificed for God. Moses spent 40 years in the house of Pharaoh, being raised as a prince of Egypt, quite literally. And then we all know the story. He spent 40 years after he fled Egypt in the desert with his father-in-law being a shepherd, and really getting his, I always say Moses got his bachelor's in leadership in Egypt. He got his master's in leadership in the desert with the dumb sheep. And then he got his doctorate in leadership and became Dr. Moses in the 40-year wandering. So you can break his life down into 40, 40, 40. But it is because of that sin of disobedience, that sin of anger against God, that God said, listen, you're doing great, but you'll never, ever go and possess the land. And that's always what we focus on, isn't it? Moses did not get to go and possess the land, and Joshua got to because he sinned against God. But why do we focus on the negative when there's so much positive in this last chapter of Moses' life? We can learn a whole lot at this funeral of this faithful servant of God. And if you'll just bear with me, we're going to go all the way through the text this evening in Deuteronomy 34, and we're going to see three things, actually four, from the funeral of Moses. First off, I want to look in verses 1 through 4 and see that Moses had a vision of the future. Look with me in verse 1 down through verse 4. We see that Moses is there in the plains of Moab, and God takes him up on this high mountain. He takes him up on this high mountain, and he's standing there, and he looks out, and what does it say? It begins to list off everywhere that Moses sees in verse 1. It says he sees Jericho, and he sees Gilead, and he sees Dan and Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim, and Manasseh, and of Judah, and all the way out to the sea. Moses is standing on top of a mountain, and God is allowing him to see the future of Israel. He's standing there, and he's looking out, and all those places that are listed here at his funeral and at his death, these are all places that the children of Israel would go and possess in the coming days and weeks and months and years. So as Moses stands there, we see that a faithful saint of God has a vision of the future. Now this is a vision of the future that Moses had throughout his entire walk with God, especially throughout his entire walk with God as they were wandering through that desert for 40 years. You understand, Moses was not shocked by what God was showing him. Moses, for 40 years, had led a bunch of stubborn, stiff-necked people. That's how they're described in the Bible. A bunch of stubborn, stiff-necked people. They had to have been a group of independent Baptists, you know. And so they're going through the desert. And Moses, they berate Moses. What do? His family talks down to him. Even his own sister gets on to him because of his wife that he has. And then she gets leprosy, praise God. That's church discipline right there at its finest. Talking against the man of God, leprosy. But and then the children of Israel, God will feed them manna. They complain about the manna. God gives them birds to eat, and they glutton themselves and they choke it down. They get in sin. God sends serpents, and then they have to. I mean, all this stuff for 40 years. What do you think kept Moses going? His vision of the future. He knew that the desert is not where they were meant to be, but that God was taking them to a much better place. So for 40 years, as Moses wandered in the desert with those people, it was his faith in God and his vision in the future that kept him going. Can I say to us as Christians that if we want to keep going when times get hard, when people are talking down about us, whenever people are against the church, when people say, oh, Faith Gospel's a terrible place, there are a bunch of crazy people up there, or when they're saying, oh, these people, you're such a terrible person, oh, you don't believe God the way you should, you don't do this the way you should, and they're attacking you personally, or you know what will keep us going? A vision of the future. Of not where we are. This world's not our home. We're just passing through. And while we're going there, we should have a vision. In fact, in Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 18, it says this, where there is no vision, the people perish. But he that keep the law happy is he. So I see at Moses' funeral at this time, right before God takes him home, we see he has a vision of the future. It's a faithful servant. He's lived his life according to all the promises that God had given him. He had a vision of the future, and he was so faithful because of the past promises that God had made to him. If you look in verse 4, what's it say? And the Lord said unto him, this is the land which I swear unto who? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give this unto thy seed. You see, we have a vision of the future if we remember the promises from the past. That's how you get a vision for the future. When God says, I'm going to establish you, I'm going to set your feet on a rock, I'm going to establish your goings. When this church was founded 70 years ago, 70 plus years ago now, and they said, we've been established by God, and we're looking to the past promises that God made. What did God promise? Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That's how every church that has ever starts, because they remember the past promises of God, so therefore they can have a future in God. You'd be a fool to start a church today. You'd be a fool to. Because churches don't last anymore. But you know why they're lasting? You know why new churches are established every day? Because men and women of God have a vision of the future in their area for a Bible teaching Baptist church or independent church or whatever church, and they get that vision and they remember the past promise that God will not let His church pass from the earth, and that's how those churches are established. Bible Truth Baptist Church, I believe is the name of it, in Welch, West Virginia. It was established just 3 years ago. People from Welch, West Virginia, don't want to be in Welch, West Virginia. I mean, they've left by the droves. And there's a man that God called and said, hey, go down there and start a church. He started a church in a county where they have consistently lost in their census. They went from 50,000 to 20,000 to 10,000. Every census that's taken, they lose populace. And he went and said, I want to start a church here. And guess what? That church is thriving and it's growing. I saw they had a revival not too long ago. People are being saved. Why? Because there's a vision. Why is that vision possible? Because he remembers the past promise of God that if you're faithful, I will be faithful to you. A faithful servant, he works towards goals. A faithful servant that will work towards goals, and he will never see the end result. And in verse 4, I want you to take note. This is always what we focus on at Moses' funeral. The Lord said unto him, this is the land I swear unto Abraham and unto Isaac and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but this is what we always focus on. But thou shalt not go over thither. That's always what we say. He didn't get to go. He didn't get to go. But you know what? That's even more amazing. Because when Moses struck the rock, it was like 20 years before this happened. Like 25 years before his death, God told him, you will never go into the promised land. But you know what he did? He kept serving God anyway. He was working towards a goal that he would never see fulfilled. He was pushing towards a place that he would never get to see. And we talked about this not too long ago when we were talking about, we owe it to the people who came before us. These tracts that I see, these ministries that we've seen started. Pastor Jordan, I think about him, just starting out and coming here and being our youth pastor. And he teaches to kids, and he will never see the fruit of that labor for some of those kids. They'll grow up, they'll get married, they'll move away, they'll be in Michigan, they'll be in California, they'll be in Tibet. He'll never see them. He'll never get to see the fruit of his labor. But he keeps doing it anyway. That's what we learn at the funeral of a faithful servant of God. Just because you won't see the result and you don't know if you'll ever know the result, that doesn't mean you don't keep working. You don't get to stop working just because you don't get to see the results of your ministry. Because you know that there are things you'll do as a faithful servant of God and you'll never see the end result this side of heaven. Well, what else do we learn at the funeral of a faithful servant of God? We saw the vision that he had for the future throughout his life, but then we see that he was honored by God and man. Look with me in verse 5 and 6. Verse 5 says this, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died in the land of Moab according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, over against Bethfor, but no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day." I want you to notice that a saint of God, when they go home to be with God, they're honored by God. It says that he lived according to the word of the Lord and died according to the word of the Lord too. Did you notice that in verse 5? It says that he died according to the word of the Lord. So the reason that he's honored by God so greatly, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but it's because he lived and died according to God's will. Moses never argues when God takes him up on the mountain. He never looks at God and says, "No, God, please, just let me go over. God, just let me walk. Just let me lead him in." He didn't negotiate. He didn't say, "God, just let me walk him through the river. Just let me get him over there and just let me die over there." Just in the promise. And God, it's been 40 years, for goodness sakes, of putting up with these people. Just let me get there. He never does that. It's God's will for him to die there, and he knows it. He never argues about it. He never begs for another second of life. He never begs God to give him one more thing than what he's already told him he's going to give him. He lived by God's will, and then he dies by the will of God too, with grace and dignity and honor. Have you noticed that? Never does Moses argue, but because of that, he is honored by God in his death. If you look with me in verse 6, it says, "And he buried him." Who? God. God himself buried Moses. You understand that, right? God himself buried Moses. Now, we don't know exactly how this took place. Did God come down in the incarnate form of Jesus Christ and get a shovel and dig a hole and bury him in it? Or did God just miraculously cause the sand to part there on the mountain and the body go down in? But you want to know what I really think when it says that he buried him? I think God, the incarnate Christ, I think he came and physically sweat and toiled and buried this man. That's what I believe. You can believe however you want to believe it. That's what I believe. You know why I believe that? Because I think he was that important to Moses. That God was that important to him, and Moses was that important to God. That's the way I vision it. Now, it could have been something completely different. The Bible doesn't tell us, but it does tell us that God himself buried Moses. The only time you ever see God sticking his hands in the dirt is to create man and to bury Moses. You never see him stick his hand in the dirt ever again. That's an honor to have your carcass buried by God in heaven. You see, whenever you live a life that honors God and you're a faithful servant, God honors you even in your death. But I want you to see, he was buried in that secret place. It says that no one knew where his sepulcher was. Now, there's a lot of reason that we look at this, and I will tell you why God did not tell anybody why he buried Moses. He did it for two reasons. One, he didn't want the children of Israel to come there and set up a shrine and start worshiping the carcass of Moses. They had proved to him before that they were that foolish, that they would do something like that. He didn't want them to do that. He didn't want to put that temptation in there. He didn't want to put that distraction to them before they went across into the promised land. So God hid him in a secret place so that they wouldn't stay there and bury Moses. But also, I believe, because maybe they wouldn't have worshiped Moses, but he didn't want them to just stay there and grieve themselves to death over Moses. Moses had been a father figure and a leader to them for 40 years. He was really, literally the only father figure that some of them ever knew. And he did not want them to stop because someone had died, because the ministry of God is bigger than any one man or woman. It has to continue in spite of the changing of the guard. And that was another reason that God didn't let them know where to go and put flour on Moses' grave, because he didn't want them to spend all their time there, because they had a whole lot more battles to fight ahead. And there's some churches out there, and I love them dearly, and I pray for them every day, but they had wonderful, godly, powerful pastors, man, for 40, 50 years, and then that man dies, and then what happens? The church falls apart. Well, listen, let me tell you something. God is bigger, and the ministry of God is bigger than the man behind the pulpit. He's just one piece of it, and he's just a small piece of it. And that despite who God has up here preaching, the ministry should continue. And that's the way it should be. But I want you to know, he was honored by God and he was honored by man. If you look in verse 8, it says, "And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. And so the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended." So he was honored by God, but he was honored by those that he led. He was honored by people. If you live a life honoring God, you live a life of service to God, you live a life of leading others to God, God will honor you, but people will honor you as well. Listen, we don't do anything for the acclaim of men. We don't do anything for the acclaim of man at all. But if you live your whole life as a Christian and you die and they bury you in the ground, there's not one person that can look and say, "He told me about God." You didn't do a good job, Christian. You didn't do a good job. Your family will come and mourn you for sure because they're going to miss you. The people in the church will come and mourn you for sure because they're going to miss you. But if there's not one person at your funeral that can look and say, "Hey, he told me about God," when nobody else would. Or "She told me about God," when nobody else would. Or "They taught my Sunday school class." Or "They were a quiet, silent witness at my work, always honoring God in everything they did. And they prayed for me." If they can't do that and honor you, why did you live your life anyway? You see, you learn something at the funeral of a faithful saint of God. He's honored by God and he's honored by man. Not because they want to give honor and glory to you, but because they want to give honor and glory to your service to God. You know, I've been to a lot of funerals in my life. One of the saddest funerals I ever went to, a pastor preached his own wife's funeral. It was terrible. I mean, it was so sad. But you want to know what made it so sad? I mean, he obviously didn't want it to end because he didn't want to say goodbye. But you want to know one of the things that made it so sad was that the church was so full and there were so many people there that when we were leaving, they said, "He was a great pastor. He's a great man of God, but she led me to the Lord. She prayed for me. She prayed in the office with me." So many ladies there, so many young people there, that as we were leaving, just a whole church full of people. And you think about pastors leading people to God, but this pastor's wife, man, what a testimony she had sitting in front of her casket. That's the kind of life we should want to lead, to be honored by God and God to be honored by our life. What else can we learn at this funeral, though? Just two more things. I want you to notice that Moses continued in his service to God until his death. In verse 7, we find out his age. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. Notice this next portion. And his eyes, and his eye was not dim, and nor his natural force abated. That means that he was still strong and strapping. And if you looked at him, you'd have looked at him and you'd have been like, "Ain't no way that guy's 120 years old." His eyes weren't dim. His faculties were still about him. He was still strong as an ox. He was still walking around with that same staff that he swung at Pharaoh's head. And there he was, 120 years old, still strong. But what do we know? Because of that strength, he was still serving. Right up until the time of his death. Something you learn at the funeral of a faithful saint of God is this. If you look back on their life, the days preceding, you'll see they were still serving God right up until the time they died. Right up until the time they went home to be with the Lord, they were still serving God. If you look with me in Deuteronomy chapter 31, Moses, just literally days before his death, he gathers all the priests and the Levites and Joshua and gives them final instructions. And that's where we find these words at 120 years old, when anybody else would give up, when anybody else would put on their slippers, when anybody else would say, I'm going to die in a few days anyways, I'm just going to sit down and quit, I'm going to rock in my rocking chair. He said, like old George Jones, I don't need your rocking chair. He was still preaching and still teaching days before he died. In verse 6, he says, be strong and of good courage. Fear not, nor be afraid of them, for the Lord thy God, He it is that doeth go with thee. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. Just days before Moses' death, he's still preaching his guts out to the Levites and to Joshua. He didn't use his age or the fact that he was getting ready to die as an excuse to stop serving God. He was still strong. And if we look in Deuteronomy 33, we see that he takes the time and God speaks through him and he blesses all the tribes of Israel. In chapter 32, I believe it is, the entire thing is a song of Moses. I mean, Moses didn't stop. These are the days leading up to his death, and he didn't stop. You know who it reminds me of? It reminds me of Bubby whenever he was laying in the hospital before me. He was in the hospital when the nurses would come in, and he was laying there dying, and he'd say, are you saved? We can't get healthy people to go and ask people that. And when he was laying in his bed, on it, literally his deathbed, Louise said every nurse, every aide, every doctor that walked in, he had a captive audience. He was a dying old man, and he knew they were going to listen to him. And what did he say? Are you saved? Praise God, that's a testimony. He didn't stop. He could have said, well, God, I'm going to die any day now. But no, he didn't. And you want to know why? I think he was honored in his death, because whenever he came home on hospice and me and Louise were sitting there, he was laying over literally on his deathbed. We went and prayed, and we were sitting there praising God about all the people we seen saved and all the amazing things that were happening at Faith Gospel Church. And she looked over and she said, I think he's gone. And he was. So what did he hear? He heard his wife and his pastor that he didn't know all that well bragging about God. And then he went to sleep and he opened his eyes and the angels were singing his praises and they were saying, hey, good job. When other people would have sat around and been sour and sorry, you was asking those people that were tending to you while you were dying, do you know Jesus Christ? Boy, I want that kind of funeral. I'll never forget that testimony as long as I live. And I guarantee you there'll be people in heaven that were at that hospital and at his bedside that will be there one day. And they'll walk up to him and they'll say, when you were dying, you saw me get life. You see, he didn't stop serving God because he knew his life was over. Moses didn't. He didn't say, oh, I'm old. Oh, I got arthritis. Oh, my back hurts. Oh, my knee hurts. I can't. He just kept going, and he was serving God right up until the moment he died. You see, that's something you learn at the funeral of a faithful saint of God. I remember there was a man named Al Gormley. I think it was Brother Al Gormley. He preached a sermon, and he went home. And as the story goes, he preached on a Sunday night. He had preached Sunday morning, Sunday night. And he went home and he was taking his shoes off and he told his wife, he said, I'm just awful tired. And I'm going to take my shoes off and throw my feet up for a minute. Will you go get me some tea? And then I'm going to make some calls and check on some people that I witnessed to this week. And she went in to get him tea. She came back. He had his feet up and he was dead. You know why? You know, he was getting ready to serve God even more. You know, and that's the kind of testimony you want. That's what you learn at the funeral of a faithful saint of God. But you know, you see that he continued serving until his death. But this is the last point, and this is something we have to understand. We see that Moses had prepared the next generation for service. Look with me in verse 9. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him, and the children of Israel hearkened unto him. And they did as the Lord commanded Moses. I see that Moses didn't leave the children of Israel without a leader. God had called a man. Moses had helped prepare that man. He was full of the spirit of wisdom from God. You see, God gave him the Spirit. God called Joshua the mighty. God called Joshua the warrior. God called Joshua the man that would slay more than, I'd say the only person that killed more people than Joshua in the Bible is probably King David. I mean, Joshua was a mighty man of war. He led the armies to destroy all of those heathen that was in the land of Canaan. And when you read the Bible and you don't whitewash it and you read it for what it says, they went in and they killed the men, the women, the children, the goats, the cats, the dogs, the birds in the cages. They killed it all. Why? How could a man do that? Because he was prepared by God. Because Moses had helped to prepare the next generation for service. He was full of the Spirit from God, full of wisdom from God, but also full of wisdom from who? Moses. Who do you think God used to instruct Joshua to be such a great man? Joshua, the son of Nun, when you see him first in the Old Testament, when you see him first, he's there with Moses. He's almost just a background character. And then you see him there, and he's with Moses, and he's helping hold his hands up. And then you see he starts to develop more and more and more. Why is that? Because God called him, and what's Moses doing? He's discipling him all the way through. And why is it then that in Deuteronomy chapter 31, I believe we just read, that when God brought the Levites in, and he brought in who? Joshua. Why? Because that became common practice, because Moses knew that he was going to die, and he was raising up the next generation. Let me tell you something, at the funeral of a faithful saint of God, you learn that faithful saints of God disciple the next generation to take their spot on the firing line. Whenever you're in a battle situation and you have a job, I was a 62 Foxtrot, I was a crane operator. I would have been about as far away from the front line as they could get me. But it was my job to make sure that if you're a radio operator, I know your job, you know my job. That way, if I'm not here tomorrow, you can jump on that crane and do what I need you to do. Why don't we have that same mentality, next man up in the Christian ranks? I mean, I'm not planning on living forever. Praise the Lord, I'm planning on going home. And if the rapture don't happen, I want there to be somebody else discipled around behind me to do what I'm doing now. You know, that's important. I mean, what do you do at church? But you do a lot at church. Who have you discipled to show them what you do in case you're not here? You could go home and be with God tomorrow. Have you discipled anybody to show them how to do your job? Oh, that's Pastor David's job. I don't know what you do. I'm going to be honest. If Connie and Charlie walked up tomorrow and said, here, can you take care of the book for this month? I'd be like, ha, no. Give it to a deacon. I don't know. I took algebra 4 times and passed it once. You don't want me handling nothing. But that's just one small example. There's all kinds of ministries that many of you do every day. You don't even think about it. You just do it. You need to disciple someone behind you. Hey, come up with me. Hey, you want to do this? Hey, you want to do that? You see, because he prepared the next generation for service, God provided the calling. God provided the spirit of wisdom. Moses provided the practical instruction. That's what we need to do. We've lost that as Christians, that it's our duty to not only see folks saved, but to see them discipled after they're saved, and see that next generation is prepared to take over when we're gone. I think God could come back tomorrow, but if he doesn't, I still want somebody here at Faith Gospel Church to keep it going, don't you? I see he prepared the next generation. It says that Moses, quote, laid his hands on him. You see, Joshua was separated and he was situated by God. That means that he was ordained. He was set apart. That's what that word means. Moses saw that he was ordained to be the next leader, so what did he do? He didn't get jealous of him. He didn't do like King Saul did so many years later when he tried to kill David the next in line. He said, let me train you to be a better man than I am. I've often heard it said, could you imagine going to interview for a church where Moses had pastored for 40 years? You get called and ordained, and the pastor's gone on to be with the Lord, and you go and you meet with the deacons and trustees, and they look at you and they say, boy, our last pastor was here for 40 years. Yeah, what kind of guy was he? Well, first thing he did after he led us out of the land of Egypt, he parted the Red Sea. And then we walked across the desert a little ways, and then he went up on this mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, and God himself showed up and scribbled on some rocks for him. He saw the backside of God. He came down and he was a glowing when he came down. And not only that, we was acting a fool, and God just had him kill a bunch of us off that was worshiping. Boy, what kind? I would be like, I don't want to be the pastor of this church. How are you going to follow that act? And then we followed him around in the desert for 40 years, and we saw God give us manna from heaven and water from rocks. And we saw all these miracles and all these things that we can't explain. We saw a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire that we followed around. We would set up an entire tent city, and then we would take it down and we'd move again. And I'd be like, no, call somebody else. Call Jack Howes. Maybe they'll send somebody. You don't want me. Listen. But Joshua, you notice there's no intimidation factor. Why? Because he was prepared. Why? Because Moses had prepared him. You see, a good leader leads. A great leader mentors. A good leader leads, but a great leader will have a leader to step up for them when they leave in their stead. And if they're a really good leader, it'll be a better leader than they were that they've trained. You see, so that's what we learn at the funeral of a faithful saint of God. I want you to notice. I want you to read this testimony. This is what we should all strive for. This is what every Christian should want said of them at their funeral. And there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And all the signs and the wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh, and to all of his servants, and to all his land, and in all the mighty hand, and in the great terror which Moses showed in the sight of Israel. Could you imagine somebody standing up at your funeral and saying that about you? Hey, God buried him himself with his own hand. He raised up a man after him. He raised up somebody after him to do what he's doing. Ain't never going to be nobody that was as faithful to God as this person was. What a testimony. What a goal. What a life to strive for. Never head bowed, never eye closed.